Here we go again.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's your brother Lيفي was here, and in today's video we're going to be refuting Hadith Critic. Now, as with all my previous victims, Hadith Critic is more than welcome to come on my platform and have a formal debate on the issues discussed in this video. Without further ado, let's jump straight into the refutation. Now, just quickly before that, if you guys want to support the da'wah and benefit from my notes and sources, the best way to do that is by joining the Patreon, joining my Discord server. You get access to all my notes and sources for only $8 a month. The link is in the description.
The science that determines the authenticity of a hadith is called ilm rijal. Rijal experts go through each individual in the chain in order to determine their trustworthiness. The issue is that Rijal experts often contradict each other. One scholar calls a narrator trustworthy, while another calls him weak in their hadith transmission. Take this guy for example, Ikrama, the slave of Ibn Abbas. Uthman ibn Hakim said, I was sitting with Abu Umama ibn Sal when Ikrama arrived. Ikrama said, O Abu Umama, I ask you by God, did you hear Ibn Abbas say, whatever Ikrama narrates from me, believe him, for he has never lied about me? Abu Umama replied, yes. Ibn Lahiya added, Ikrama also adopted the beliefs of Najd al-Haruri, a leader of the Khawarij, and spent 6 months with him. Then he returned to Ibn Abbas, who upon seeing him said, here comes the evil one. Yahya ibn Bukair said, Ikrama traveled to Egypt and lived there. Then he went to Maghreb, where the Khawarij of that region took their beliefs from him. Ali ibn al-Madini said, Ikrama followed the views of Najd al-Haruri, the leader of the Khawarij. Ahmad ibn Zuhair said, I heard Yahya ibn Ma'in say, Malik did not include Ikrama in his Muwatta because he followed the views of Sufriya sect. Amr ibn Qais al-Maki narrated from Atta, Ikrama was an Ibadi, another Khawarij sect. Abu Maryam said, Ikrama was a Bayhasid, another faction of the Khawarij. Yahya al-Katan said Ibn Abbas' top 6 students were Mujahid, Tawus, Atta, Sa'id, Ikrama, and Jabir. Ikrama received contradictory evaluations from hadith critics. Some praised him, while others severely criticized him. Despite accusations of lying, belonging to a violent sect responsible for killing Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, and reportedly standing outside mosques, takfiring the inhabitants, his narrations were still deemed reliable enough to be included in Sahih Bukhari. This inconsistency highlights the subjective nature of Rijal methodology in their hadith authentication.
So first of all, even if there were contradictory gradings, that wouldn't actually invalidate ilm al-rijal. Just like if there was a scientist and he disagrees with another scientist about what is the best explanation of the evidence at hand, that would not invalidate the scientific method. Secondly, the whole point of the muhaddithin is to go through these statements of various scholars and see which ones are actually objective and have a basis and which ones are wrong, incorrect and slanderous. So quoting slanderous reports against Ikrimah to try and invalidate him does nothing than show your utter incompetence when it comes to ilm al-hadith. Now, regarding the slander against Ikrimah, the scholars evaluated these statements and found that they had no basis. At-Tabari explains this point plainly. As for what has been attributed to Ikrimah of the doctrine of the Sufriya, if it were the case that everyone against whom someone alleged one of the blameworthy schools and sects that made an allegation that had not been established against him must have his uprightness removed, his testimony invalidated, and his reliance on his hadith abandoned, then that would necessitate abandoning reliance on the narration of every transmitter for whom anything has been recorded among the hadith scholars of all the regions, because there is no one among them except that some people had attributed something to them which one group would dislike while others would approve of. Yahya bin Ma'in said, if you see someone speaking ill of Ikrimah and Hamad bin Salma, then suspect him of his Islam. Ahmad al-Ijli said, he was a trustworthy Meccan follower, innocent of what people accuse him of regarding the Khawarij. Al-Bukhari said, there is no one among our companions who does not use Ikrimah as an authority. Al-Nisa'i said he was trustworthy. Ibn Manda said in his Sahih, as for the status of Ikrimah himself, he was deemed trustworthy by the leading scholars of the Tabi'een and those after them, and they narrate from him and used his unique narrations as evidence in matters of attributes, sunnah and rulings. Approximately 300 men from various countries narrated from him, including more than 70 of the best and most eminent of the Tabi'un. This is a status hardly found for many of the Tabi'een. Moreover, those scholars who criticized him did not refrain from narrating from him, nor did they dispense with his hadith. His hadith was received with acceptance and used as evidence generation after generation, and imam after imam used it until the time of the 4 imams who compiled the Sahih, distinguishing its authentic from its weak and its errors from its correct, including the narrations of Ikrimah. They are Bukhari, Muslim, Ibn Dawood, and Al-Nisa'i. They all agreed to include his hadith and used it as evidence. Even though Muslim had the worst opinion of him, yet he included his hadith in conjunction with others and considered him trustworthy after criticizing him. Now what's funny here is that these people are the first to tell you that hadith are a game of telephone and they're just rumors going around, but they have no issue using rumors that have been disproven to slander narrators to try and jab at the hadith.
Personal biases also impacted the comments made about certain narrators. Narrators were slandered if their views opposed those of hadith scholars. Take for example Imam Malik. He slandered Ibn Ishaq and called him a Dajjal. Ibn Ishaq compiled the biography of the Prophet Muhammad that Muslims accept today. Yet Imam Malik called him out for his deceptions and was slandered across the Rijal corpus.
So the argument here is, if hadith are reliable, then why did one scholar say something mean to another scholar?
From what I can tell, I mean, some of these arguments are like, they just seem so bad. It's like not even worth engaging with. You know, it's like, oh.
Needless to say that scholars beefing with each other has no bearing whatsoever on the authenticity or the veracity of the Sunni ilm al-rijal. Second of all, this actually matches with the criteria of embarrassment, because if the ilm al-rijal was just fabricated en masse and people could write whatever they want, then why would they choose to include embarrassing details that look bad on paper? I mean, this level of stupidity is actually embarrassing.
Ilm al-Rijal is also just circular reasoning. We trust a narrator because a biographer said so, but we trust the biographer because someone else said so. Take this hadith for example. The Prophet narrates to Ibn Abbas, who narrates to Ikramah. But how do we know Ikramah is trustworthy? Look at his biography. Yahya said he was trustworthy. But how do I know Yahya al-Qattan is trustworthy enough to make that judgment? How can I trust Yahya? Let's look at his biography. Ibn Hatim al-Razi said he was trustworthy. But how do I know Ibn Hatim al-Razi is trustworthy enough to make that judgment? Until an endless circular loop occurs where I can never know who is objectively trustworthy, which makes all of these comments hearsay.
But how do we know hadith critic is trustworthy? Let's look at his biography. See, it says over here that you're a dishonest clown. I guess that means you're not trustworthy and all your comments are hearsay. No, but for real though. So here the claim is that ilm al-rijal methodology is circular reasoning because we're just assuming that each narrator is trustworthy without justification. And this is false. We have a foundational justification that comes from the Quran itself, because the Quran tells us to follow the Sahaba and praises them and tells us to follow them in multiple different verses, but one of them being chapter 9 verse 100. Therefore Allah actually testifies to the uprightness, the general uprightness and the trustworthiness of the Sahaba of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, which breaks the infinite regress. The second thing is that this kind of critique assumes a type of Humean skepticism that we're just not going to grant. Methodologically, we start with the assumption that a report has a genuine matter of fact until it is invalidated by palpable bias. This is noted not only by Sunni scholars, but even Western scholars like Sargent or Montgomery Watt or Nadia Abbott. They take the same position and use the same methodology. So your assumption of a priori doubt on every trade-in is something that needs justification, which you have not provided. Why should we as Muslims be intellectually colonized into assuming that the white man's epistemology is correct? You need to justify why your epistemology is correct. Why should I care about what David Hume says? And why should I superimpose that on the hadith corpus? You haven't given me a justification. Now this is sad because hadith critic presents himself as a rational mind, as a rational critiquer of hadith, when in reality what he's doing is blind following David Hume and bootlicking Western scholarship, assuming that their epistemology is correct and trying to superimpose that on the hadith corpus. This essentially amounts to smuggling in Western assumptions and trying to use that to undermine the hadith corpus. It doesn't get more dishonest than this.
Individuals who forged or altered chains still appeared in authentic hadith compilations. Take for example Sulayman al-A'mash. He's reported to have committed tadlis al-isnad, essentially lying about his source of a narration, yet he narrates countless hadith in the most authentic compilation of hadith, and even more in the lesser authentic books. Scholars have tried to wiggle their way out of this by saying, well, he only committed tadlis for certain narrators, so we can accept his narrations when he doesn't narrate from those specific people. But this is a stupid argument. It's like saying, well, this journalist only fabricated sources for political stories, so we can trust their reporting on everything else.
So here this buffoon is only giving you part of the picture. Tadlis essentially refers to the concealment of a narrator's source. Now there are different types of tadlis that are ranging from malicious intentional tadlis to unintentional mistakes. So for example, if someone does an'ana where he says on the authority of so-and-so, an fulan for example, and he is deliberately hiding the identity of the source of the information that he is narrating, then this is a malicious type of tadlis that would invalidate a person from being trustworthy. But if, for example, someone mistakenly misremembered their source, that's not necessarily lying, it's just an honest mistake on the part of a tradent. And the muhaddithin would be able to sift through and see which person is doing tadlis maliciously and which person is just making a mistake. So with someone like Sulaiman al-A'mash, his tadlis simply amounts to misremembering his source or confusing his source, not necessarily lying about his source or being malicious, trying to hide his source of information. The muhaddithin would categorize the levels of tadlis and they would act accordingly. If someone was malicious and intentionally lying, they wouldn't use his hadith, whereas if it was an honest mistake, then that person would still be used with strict conditions being imposed on them. They would have to be, for example, corroborated through an alternative chain. So when he strawmans our scholars into saying, oh, he only lied about this particular thing, so it's okay to trust him with this other story, well, that's not actually what the muhaddithin are saying. What they're actually saying is that this tradent is trustworthy, but his transmission route in this particular instance suffers from an ambiguity that we need to analyze and see whether he's hearing this directly from someone or whether there's a hidden defect or a hidden person in between the person that he's quoting. Essentially, they're saying that this narrator is giving an ambiguous wording and we need further clarification, which is why they continue to use him, especially in cases where he was corroborated.
Chapter 5 verse 3 states that the religion was completed, yet hadith were compiled centuries later. The Quran plainly says, "Today I have perfected your religion for you." If Islam was truly perfected during the Prophet's lifetime, why would essential teachings be scattered for 200 plus years before Bukhari came along? Even worse, the entire system for checking which narrators were trustworthy took centuries later to develop. Think about it. God says the religion is complete. But Sunnis claim we need centuries of human effort just to figure out what the complete religion actually included and looked like. That makes no sense. Either God completed the religion as he said, or he left it incomplete until scholars had to piece it together generations later. Both can't be true.
Hadith rejectors have this misunderstanding that hadith were written down 200 years after the Prophet, and before that they never existed. Even Orientalists like Goldzinger had no issue granting that the hadith were actually written down at the time of the Prophet. He says, quote, "Many a companion of the Prophet is likely to have carried his sahifa with him and used it to dispense instruction and edification to his circle." So this idea that hadith just spawned in 200 years after the death of the Prophet with the existence of Bukhari and Muslim and the later hadith compilers is completely unfactual. Secondly, this buffoon misunderstands chapter 5 verse number 3. When Allah says, "اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا." This refers to the fundamental doctrines and legislations that have been delivered. As Al-Imam Al-Qurtubi notes in his tafsir, وقال الجمهور المراد معظم الفرائض والتحليل والتحريم. A little further down he says, أي بإكمال الشرائع والأحكام وإظهار الدين الإسلام كما وعدتكم. So during the lifetime of the Prophet, Islam was complete. The hadith is just the formalization or the codification of the Prophet's teaching that were already complete during his lifetime. If we were to understand chapter 5 verse 3 in the way our opponents want us to understand it, then we would have to say that the Quran itself isn't complete when this verse was revealed, because this verse wasn't the last verse that was revealed. The Quran itself wasn't compiled in one official volume the same day chapter 5 verse 3 was revealed. That doesn't contradict its completeness. In the exact same way, the hadith's later formalization does not violate the concept of a perfected religion. The teachings were already there, just not formalized in the way we have them now.
Early scholars like Abu Hanifa were not strong in hadith reliance. In fact, he was takfired for rejecting hadith reliance, showing that it wasn't universal. Just look at the comments that were made against Abu Hanifa during his lifetime.
If this mistake had been divided over the ummah of Muhammad, it would verily have encompassed all of them. No newborn was born in Islam that was worse for them, that is the Muslims, than Abu Hanifa. Nobody was born in Islam that is worse than Abu Hanifa and Abu Muslim, and would not love that it befell my soul that I am better than any of them, even if I would have the dunya and what is in it. That which we resent Abu Hanifa for is that he would come to the hadith of the Prophet, and then he would contradict it to something else. Nobody was born in Islam that is more calamitous for this ummah than Abu Hanifa.
These statements that were made against Abu Hanifa reveal a very crucial historical fact. One of Islam's most revered jurists, whose legal school is followed by nearly half of all Muslims today, was viciously attacked, specifically because he challenged hadith supremacy. But yet, traditionalists now present absolute hadith reliance as this unquestioned historical consensus. The narrative that hadith centricism was always the orthodox position is contradicted by the life and reception of Abu Hanifa himself.
The idea that Al-Imam Al-A'zam Abu Hanifa was a hadith rejector is a laughable and comically absurd proposition. I mean, this kind of revisionism puts Joshua Little to shame. Even he wouldn't be on board with this level of stupidity. In fact, I'd like to challenge my friend Hadith Critic to provide a single reference of any scholar, contemporary or otherwise, who says that Abu Hanifa rejected the legislative authority of Hadith. You won't find it because it doesn't exist. In fact, Abu Hanifa himself used hadith and narrated them himself. And you can find his hadith in his musnad that I'll put on screen now. All these hadiths have Abu Hanifa in the chain. So this hadith rejector now has to say that all these hadiths are being back projected on Abu Hanifa, and none of the Muslims caught these back projections, which is hilarious. As far as the statements that he brought criticizing Abu Hanifa, these statements have to be understood in their historical context. Abu Hanifa lived in a time where the codification of hadith had not yet happened, and as such he was a mujtahid, meaning not every authentic hadith would have reached Abu Hanifa. As such, he was famous for his use of analogical reasoning or reasoning by qiyas. So the only hadith Abu Hanifa would reject are weak hadiths that were uncertain. To try and twist this into making it seem like Abu Hanifa is the same as you and rejected the legislative authority of the hadith as a whole is completely absurd. This just demonstrates how desperate you are to try and find precedent for your view in the early Muslim generations. And in fact, there is no precedent for your view because there weren't hadith rejectors during the time of the Sahaba and the Tabi'un and the Atba' Tabi'un. In fact, we even have contemporary non-Muslim accounts that document how strictly the earliest generations of Muslims adhered to the written traditions and laws of the Prophet Muhammad. For example, we have East Syrian monk and chronicler John Bar Penkei, who's writing in the 7th century. According to Hoyland, this East Syrian monk and chronicler presents Muhammad as a guide and instructor, as a result of whose teaching the Arabs held to the worship of the one God in accordance with the customs of ancient law. John also makes him out to be a legislator, observing of the Arabs that they kept to the tradition of Muhammad to such an extent that they inflicted the death penalty upon anyone who was seen to act brazenly against his laws. Now these laws are not the Quran. These laws are the legislations that the Prophet provided, which are outside the Quran. The term traditions here implies something handed down, but one doubts that a fixed corpus of rulings from Muhammad is meant. Most likely, John is simply relaying the message given out by the Muslims themselves that they adhere to and enforce the example of their Prophet. If that wasn't already bad enough, we can also do isnad kun matan analysis and prove that the earliest Muslims considered hadith to be legislation outside of the Quran and considered it to be binding. An example of this is the verses about stoning and breastfeeding, which were abrogated from the Quran according to the earliest Sahaba, such as Aisha and Umar. Now, when we do isnad kun matan analysis, we can verify that these reports do in fact trace back to Umar and Aisha. That means that Aisha and Umar and the early generations of Muslims who disseminated this hadith considered the hadith to be a legislative source of authority outside of the Quran. That's why, according to secular academics like Wael Hallaq, he says, quote, "There is little doubt that the core of the Sunniyak material that was inspired by the vitally important issues raised in the Quran represents a portrait of the actual Sunnah enacted by the Prophet. It would be inconceivable that all these issues were confined to the Quran and excluded from the Sunnah. Such matters pertain to inheritance, taxes, and property, and which were dealt with in a range and variety more or less equal to the range and variety in which these matters were recorded in the Quran, are examples of authentic Sunnah. Their inauthenticity, in fact, cannot be established, meaning it is beyond question that the core of the Sunniyak hadith tradition is, in fact, what the Prophet preached and what the earliest Muslims adhered to. The Salaf were not Western bootlicking hadith rejectors like you."
Sunnis consider hadith collections sacred. The authentic hadith themselves say the Prophet never commanded his sayings to be recorded. In fact, he forbade it. This creates a bizarre contradiction. If hadith are truly essential to the religion, why do the hadith themselves tell us not to record or rely on them? According to Sahih Muslim 3004, the Prophet prohibited writing down his words, yet centuries later hadith collections emerged, completely contradicting this prohibition. If we take hadith seriously, then we must take seriously the hadith that invalidate hadith collections together. We also have multiple hadith that confirm that the Prophet left behind only the Quran, nothing else. Ibn Abbas was asked if the Prophet left anything beside the Quran, and his response? He did not leave anything except what is between the two bindings of the Quran. Ali was asked the same question. He swore by God that they had nothing except the Quran and a personal understanding of it. If even the Prophet's closest companions swore that the only divine text, only wahi, that he left was the Quran, how can hadith be considered second divine authority? In Sahih al-Bukhari 2155, the Prophet himself rebuked people for adding regulations and religious conditions that were not found in the Quran. He declared, whoever imposes such a condition as is not in Allah's laws, then that condition is invalid, even if he imposes 100 conditions. If a condition not found in the Quran is invalid, then how can a hadith, which imposes countless religious rules outside the Quran, somehow be illegitimate? The Quran forbids unnecessary questions. According to Sahih Muslim 12b, it states that the Quran itself warns against excessive questioning of the Prophet. This suggests that Islam was meant to be simple, rooted in the Quran alone, without massive webs of legal rulings found in the hadith.
So here this boot-looking clown is trying to run an internal critique on the Sunni position. The supposed contradiction is, why are we using hadith if the Prophet ordered us not to write them down? Now on this issue I'll refer to Sheikh Mustafa al-A'zami, who says, quote, even this hadith, which is transmitted by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri on the authority of the Prophet, is disputed among scholars. According to al-Bukhari and others, it is the statement of Abu Sa'id himself that is erroneously attributed to the Prophet. Now what this hadith actually meant is that nothing should be written with the Quran on the same sheet, because this might lead someone to conclude that sentences or words written in the margin or between lines belong to the Quran. It should be remembered that this order was given in the period when the Quran was being revealed, and when the text itself was incomplete. Otherwise, there does not appear to be any sound reason to forbid the writing of hadith. The Prophet himself sent hundreds of letters, many of them were very lengthy, containing the formula for prayers and worship. According to the Quran, the Prophet's conduct and deeds should be followed by the community, and the Quran itself demands the record of credit transactions. Therefore, it looks as if there were no general instructions not to record the ahadith, though it might have been explained by some of the scholars this way. On the other hand, there is clear evidence to show that the Prophet approved of recording hadith. Further, we find that quite a number of companions recorded a hadith, and among them were those people who were responsible for transmitting hadith which forbade its recording. Bearing all of this in mind, one arrives at the conclusion that the Prophet's disapproval of writing hadith most probably meant the writing of the Quran and non-Quranic material on the same sheet. So to summarize, this hadith is inauthentic, it is marfu' to the Prophet. Secondly, this prohibition was specifically for writing hadith on the same paper as the Quran, not prohibiting the writing of hadith generally. Now regarding the companions who disliked writing hadith, he says, quote, summing up the argument regarding the reasons for disliking recording, there is no evidence that the interdiction of writing was based on the order of the Prophet. It was based on one time or another on personal prejudice. Nevertheless, the same scholars continued a hadith to writing. The recent research has proved that almost all the hadith of the Prophet was written down in the lifetime of the companions, which stretched to the end of the 1st century. And as we've already established, hadith were already being written down during the life of the Prophet. Now the second point he made was regarding the hadith that the only thing the Prophet left behind was the Quran. Now when the hadith says that the only thing that the Prophet left behind is the Quran, this is obviously hyperbolic. This only is not without exception, because the Prophet left behind his kids, his wife, his house, etc. So this hadith is not a denial of the authority of the Sunnah, it's simply claiming that the Quran is preserved and complete, which is correct. It's honestly embarrassing how badly these clowns have to butcher the hadith in order to try and twist it into their demented worldview. Now on the hadith about asking too many questions, if this jahil bothered to open up a book and read, I know reading is hard, but if he actually bothered to open up a book and read the commentary of that hadith, he would understand that the questions being referred to in that hadith are not genuine jurisprudential questions like those raised in the books of fiqh. Rather, these are questions that are intended to waste time by insincere people. Again, there is nothing in this hadith that indicates that the companions were hadith rejectors or that the Prophet ordered us only to follow the Quran.
If hadith collectors were truly strict in our authentication process, why did they accept narrations from people with extreme, openly biased views? Take Abbad ibn Yaqub, a narrator found in Sahih Bukhari. Despite holding radical Shia beliefs that directly contradict Sunni Islam, he cursed Uthman, one of the 4 rightly guided caliphs. He swore that Talha and Zubair wouldn't enter paradise, 2 of the Prophet's companions. He insisted that Muslims must curse the Prophet's enemies in daily prayers, which is a view exclusive to extreme Shia theology. He taught that the 11 noble leaders from the Prophet's progeny would rule, a clear endorsement of the Shia Imamate doctrine. He even claimed the soil of Karbala is superior to the Kaaba itself. Yet somehow, Bukhari and other Sunni hadith collectors still included his narrations. This raises a huge problem. Hadith scholars rejected countless narrators for minor disagreements, yet somehow Abbad's extreme anti-Sunni views weren't a deal breaker. So which is it? Were hadith scholars inconsistent and unreliable, or was the entire process shaped by political convenience rather than any type of divine truth? Either way, the hadith system collapses under its own contradictions. If scholars selectively accepted narrators based on factors beyond reliability, then how can we trust hadith as a whole? To drive the point home even more, Imam Dahabi is quoted saying, if the hadith of these Shia narrators were to be rejected, a large number of Sunni prophetic traditions would be lost, and this would be a clear corruption. So even by the view of Sunni scholars like Imam Dahabi, we would not have Sunni hadith without the Shia.
I want to move on to share this really, really beautiful quote by Dahabi, and this pretty much sums up everything, or not everything, but a lot of it. Okay, so here, and this is in Mizan al-I'tidal, he's speaking about Aban bin Taghlib, all right? And what he does is he quotes, or he mentions these scholars that have declared Aban to be trustworthy. He mentions Ibn Hanbal, Ibn Ma'in, Abu Hatim al-Razi, and then he says, and Ibn Adi mentioned him and said that he was an extreme Shi'i. And then he says, how is it possible for someone, what if someone says, how is it possible for someone to be declared a trustworthy, or how can one be a trustworthy innovator, at the same time be trustworthy in being just and being proficient with reports? And he mentions that there are two examples of bid'ah, one that's a lesser bid'ah and one that's a greater bid'ah. And then he says, and here's the thing, what I love about this statement by Dhahabi is it's so objective, akhi. He says that a lower level of bid'ah is ghuluf tashayyu', extreme Shi'ism is a low level, he says this, or just Shi'ism without being extreme. And he says that this can be found a lot in Tabi'in and those that came after them, and they were people, okay, of religiosity, piety, and truth. All right, that's the main thing here, all right, and truth. And he says, and if we were to reject these people, then we'd be missing out on a lot of narrations, and there's a major mafsad in this, there's a major loss in this. And then he says, and then there's the major innovation, which is full out raf, right? And major ghulu in raf. And it includes attacking Abu Bakr and Umar and calling people onto that. And then he says that we should not be relying upon them. And now, here's what he says. This is really interesting. He says, and this is the main point. He says, I can't recall anyone, and by the way, Dhahabi will disagree with people disagree with Dhahabi on this, but I want you to look at the main idea here. He says that no one comes to my mind from this sort of person that's truthful. However, rather, lying is, their shi'ar, their shi'ar, help me out here.
Defining quality.
Hello, defining quality, and taqiyya and nifaq. All right? Now, taqiyya is the main word here. Now, that's because naturally, objectively speaking, if a person is forming taqiyya and he's lying to you, then it's only natural to consider him a liar and to not rely upon him for hadith. I mean, how is this not objective? If someone was to reject Arafuli because he performs taqiyya, well, how is that objectionable? How is that a problem? If the Shi'i is truthful, we'll accept him. And the ulama have accepted them. And they have actually accepted a Rafuli narrator if he's truthful. Rafuli narrator is truthful. However, if he is applying taqiyya, khalas. How would you accept someone who lies within his deen, for his religion? So yeah, that's a very important quote I felt needed to be shared.
Now just to add on to what Brother Fareed said, specifically for Abbad ibn Ya'qub, Al-Bukhari did not narrate from him except when he was joint with another narrator. So the whole reason Bukhari would narrate with him is to show his weakness in hadith. The rest of the muhaddithin didn't use him. For example, An-Nisa'i said he is not reliable, Darqutni said he is to be abandoned in narration, Ibn Hibban said he was an advocate of extreme tashayyu' and transmits fabricated hadith. So it's not like our muhaddithin were blissfully ignorant of the fact that this person was an untrustworthy narrator. What's funny is that this dishonest clown is attacking the Sunni ilm al-rijal because we used Shia-leaning narrators. But if we didn't use Shia-leaning narrators, then he would be the first person to say you only accept someone who is orthodox and agrees with your views, and if they don't agree with your views, then you discount them regardless of their trustworthiness. So you're being unfair. So this kind of critique is heads I win, tails you lose. It's a dishonest approach. No matter how we deal with people with unorthodox opinions, no matter how we treat them, the Orientalists and the Hadith rejectors are going to find anything to try and attack us with. And that's the sign of dishonest argumentation.
The 6 canonical collections contain contradictory versions of the same events, even on basic biographical facts. For example, Sahih Bukhari claims the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 13 years after receiving revelation, but then contradicts itself by stating it was 10 years in another hadith. Meanwhile, Sahih Muslim reports that the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 15 years while receiving divine revelation. These aren't minor details, but fundamental timeline contradictions about the Prophet's life and collections supposedly vetted for accuracy. Later scholars created even more contradictions trying to fix the original contradictions. Like for example, Sheikh Ahmed Shakir claims Ibn Abbas sometimes counted differently. Ibn Kathir invents this 3-year period when Israfil, not Gabriel, was teaching Muhammad before the Quran's revelation, and Ibn Hajar suggests narrators were simply rounding. So these desperate reconciliation attempts show scholars recognized the contradictions, but couldn't admit the obvious, that these collections contained errors.
On the issue of contradictions, now even if we grant that hadith do have contradictions, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't follow hadith. As Nadia Abbott notes, Az-Zuhri received a genuine core of the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad from his contemporaries. Why would we stop following the words of the Prophet because there are contradictions in secondary or tertiary details? Secondly, all history has contradictions. This is inherent to the nature of historical reports. These contradictions arise from a lapse in human memory or the variation that is found in oral tradition, but regardless of the reason, this is something inherent to every historical report. So if you're going to be consistent, then you're going to have to throw out everything that has historical contradictions, so you're not going to be left with any history at all. As a simple example, the Gospels contain many contradictions. For example, the portrayal of Jesus' crucifixion. If my opponent is consistent, he's going to have to say there are contradictory portrayals of how Jesus was crucified, therefore we can't use the Gospels as a source of history, therefore Jesus didn't even exist. Now, as Sunnis, we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. As Sargent notes, data collected from oral reports will naturally contain inconsistencies, sometimes suppressions or contradictions, the amazing Arab memory for detail notwithstanding. But criticism of historical sources should aim at eliciting from them what is possible to accept as evidence, not manufacturing a case for destroying them in toto. So these aren't desperate attempts at reconciliation. This is standard historical procedure. What's funny is that even according to Western academic scholars like Joshua Little, he concedes that the hadith methodology of ilm al-rijal was successful in weeding out contradictions in the material. As far as the contradiction he brought up about how long did the Prophet stay in Mecca, Ibn Hajar says, quote, "There is disagreement on how long he stayed in Mecca after prophethood. Some said it is 13 years, others said 10, some said 15. This can be reconciled by noting that some counted the interim period of no revelation, whereas others did not, and some were approximating, whereas others were not."
The Wahi dilemma exposes a fundamental flaw in Sunni reliance on hadith as a source of religious law. The Quran explicitly states that those who rule by anything other than God's revelation are disbelievers, unjust, and wicked. It also affirms that the scripture alone was sent to judge among the people. This posed a major problem for early Sunni scholars whose legal rulings and theology depended heavily on hadith. If only God's revelation was to be followed, how could they justify using hadith as a source of law? To solve this issue, Sunni scholars invented the doctrine that hadith itself was wahi, or divine revelation. This idea was first formalized by Shafi'i, who argued that the Quranic term hikmah, or wisdom, referred to hadith, which gave it this divine status. However, historical evidence shows that this interpretation was not common before Shafi'i, and was largely his own innovation. Even hadith contradicts his claim, like in Sahih Bukhari 30047, where Ali is asked if the Prophet left any wahi besides the Quran, and he emphatically says no. This means that the hadith, or the idea of the hadith as revelation, was constructed after the Prophet's time and has no basis in the Quran or early Islamic understandings.
Alright, so let's go one by one and break down the series of blunders this buffoon just made. Firstly, he regurgitates the claims of Joseph Schacht that Ash-Shafi'i was the one who came up with this idea that hadith are wahi, and before that the word sunnah just simply meant the lived tradition. Now, of course, this is contradicted by the earliest witnesses. If you open up Tafsir al-Tabari, you'll find the Athar commentating on the verse of the Quran, وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. Qatada said, the hikmah is the sunnah. Now, Qatada died about 117 after Hijri, whereas Ash-Shafi'i died around 204 Hijri. Therefore, Schacht's claim that Ash-Shafi'i originated this idea is blatantly false and contradicted by the available evidence. And it's not just Qatada. I can quote tens of people who held to the exact same position from the Salaf. So it's not like Qatada's the only one transmitting this idea. On your paradigm, you'd have to say all of these are false fabrications and back projections, which is an ad hoc auxiliary hypothesis with no justification. Secondly, Sheikh Mustafa al-Azami already refuted Schacht on this point, and he's not alone in his refutation. Schacht has therefore failed to prove his point that the concept of the Sunnah in the ancient schools of law was not identical with the content of the traditions from the Prophet. In the majority of cases, it denoted the Sunnah of the Prophet and not the living tradition. Moreover, the Sunnahs of the Prophet were given binding authority over any other legal precedents or opinions. Similarly, Jarallah notes in his dissertation that M. Braveman devotes an extensive chapter to the concept of Sunnah in his book. He contends that the concept of Sunnat Rasulullah is a very early and genuine Islamic idea that cannot be considered as based on later doctrinal considerations. Even revisionists like Norman Calder concede that Schacht's claims are far too strong and not supported by the available evidence. That the Shafi'i school was ahead of other schools in devising hermeneutical arguments that would ensure the accommodation of the law to a growing set of prophetic hadith can be accepted, but not as far ahead as Schacht would have us believe. So now I've quoted traditional scholars who believe that Schacht's ideas are flawed and fallacious, and I've even quoted revisionist scholars who agree that Schacht overstates his claims and his claims are not actually supported by the available evidence. And as I've already showed, hadiths were already written down during the times of the Prophet and were considered authoritative and legally binding by his contemporaries, including his wives and companions and the generations of scholars and fuqaha that followed them. So in fact, the historical data does not support the revisionism of Shaykh and hadith critic, but it in fact supports the traditional Sunni account of early Islam. Now the hadith he quoted is not saying that the Prophet left behind no guidance except the Quran, therefore the Sunnah is not revelation. All it's doing is answering a specific question. The question is, did he leave behind any other written thing or codex, like a book? And the answer is, no, only the Quran collected between the covers is what was left in physical form. To decontextualize this hadith and try and make it seem like this is a denial of the authority of the Sunnah of the Prophet shows how desperate you are to attack the hadith corpus.
But this claim creates a serious theological problem for Sunnis. If hadith is wahi, then every Sunni scholar must ensure they never falsify a claim of a fabricated hadith as divine revelation.
I want you guys to appreciate the absolute stupidity up on display here. So let's examine this diagram. So the first horn is accepting fabricated hadith. And the verse he quotes is, "Who is more unjust than the one who invents a lie about Allah?" If a Muslim unintentionally, out of ignorance, accepts a fabricated report, how does that mean that he's fabricating sayings against Allah? So this verse doesn't even support the first horn. The second horn is just as bad. He says the second horn is rejecting authentic hadith. And the verse he quotes here is, "But those who reject our signs and treat them with arrogance, they are the companions of the fire, they will abide therein." This verse is not talking about authentic hadith of the Prophet. This verse is talking about those who deny the verses of Allah in the Quran. That's who the verse is talking about. It has nothing to do with authenticating hadith. The absolute incompetency of this Quranist is embarrassing. All you can do is distort the Quran. The second reason this is a false dilemma is because even if we grant that his understanding of the verses is correct, the conclusion doesn't logically follow. Why would we be damned in hell for accepting a weak report or making a mistake? This is a non sequitur. It just does not follow. If it wasn't bad enough that his argument is fallacious and invalid, it's also contradicted by the Quran. Allah says in the Quran, "Inna Allah la yaghfiru an yushraka bihi wa yaghfiru ma duna dhalik." That indeed Allah does not forgive those who associate partners with him, but he forgives whatever is less than that. So even if we were to concede his incorrect, distorted understanding of the Quranic verses he quotes, the Quran itself says that he would forgive us.
The hadith of the drought provides a clear example where major scholars like Ibn Hajar and Ibn Kathir authenticated narration, while Al-Albani explicitly weakened it. This shows that even with the same evidence, top scholars reach opposite conclusions about what constitutes wahi in the hadith.
In regards to these intricate matters, doesn't the existence of these minor differences of opinion suggest that the methodology, hadith methodology as a whole, is flawed?
Yeah, you caught us. We're just wasting our time. No, I think that people disagree. Here's one thing. When you look at the statements of the early scholars of hadith, you sometimes see that they're describing one transmitter with lots of contradictory statements. And on further inspection, you realize that you have no idea what you're talking about, and they're actually all saying the same thing. So let me give you an example of it. I wrote about this on the Arabic Al-Hadith forum when I was criticizing the idea of mutashaddidun. This taqsim al-thulathi. So you have mutashaddidun, mutasahilun, mutawassitun, people that are strict, lenient, and in the middle, or fair. And so, for example, you have a person like Yahya ibn Abdullah ibn Bukayr, right? The translator from Leyth ibn Sa'd. When you look at the fact that his hadith are found in both Bukhari and Muslim, which suggests he's the pinnacle of reliability. And then you look at Abu Hatim saying he's salih, which means his hadith should be written, but he's not used as a hujjah by himself. You may picture that they are at entirely different opinions. Whereas when you look down actually into the reality of it, you see that Yahya ibn Abdullah ibn Bukayr is not used by himself in Bukhari. He's either transmitting from a Layth, and he's the best student of a Layth, or when he's transmitting from other people, Al-Bukhari and others present corroborating proofs for his hadith.
Understood.
So
yeah.
when you look at it, you see at first two entirely contradicting opinions. And then when you study it, you realize that no, in reality, it revolves around the same idea.
Now, in addition to what you just heard, it's important to note that disagreement doesn't invalidate a science. Just because Roger Penrose disagrees with Brian Greene about the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics, whether it's the Copenhagen interpretation or the many worlds interpretation, that does not invalidate the scientific method. In the exact same way, when muhaddithin reach different conclusions, that doesn't invalidate the science of hadith. Again, this simply doesn't follow, and hadith critic is a fallacy machine that doesn't know what a non sequitur is. Furthermore, if you look into the literature, you'll find that early hadith critics appear to have adhered to a consistent system of criticism that likely developed in the generation before Al-Imam Al-Shafi'i. If we look at the actual studies done and analyze to see what is the level of agreement between the muhaddithin, we find that even revisionist scholars like Scott C. Lewis say, quote, "I mentioned earlier that Ibn Ma'in graded 203 of Ibn Sa'd's 1,105 evaluated men, and it is striking that there is agreement between the two critics in 87% of cases and disagreement in only 13%. When comparing Ibn Sa'd and Ibn Hanbal, he notes that the agreement reached 85%. It's also worth noting that the remaining 10 to 15% that they disagreed on were minor disagreements. It's not like they were saying one person is a fabricator and another person is 100% thiqah. It's just they disagreed upon where to place them on the scale, what level of tadlis they did, for example.
Many hadith scholars worked closely with governments of their time, which meant their teachings and reports could be influenced by political rulers. A great example is Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, a famous hadith collector who was heavily connected to the Umayyad rulers. Some scholars criticized him for being too close to the government, saying he allowed himself to be used to serve their interests. For instance, Yahya ibn Ma'in, a respected scholar, preferred another transmitter, Al-A'mash, over al-Zuhri because Al-A'mash was stricter in his methods and did not let rulers influence him. It says, quote, when Yahya ibn Ma'in was once asked to compare him with Zuhri, Yahya preferred A'mash because he observed more strict transmission procedures than Zuhri, and he did not let himself be used by the authorities as Zuhri had been used by the Umayyads. This wasn't unique to al-Zuhri. Many scholars were employed by rulers as judges, tax collectors, or advisors. The government often promoted hadiths that supported their authority and discouraged rebellion. This means that political power played a role in shaping which hadiths were preserved and spread.
So this argument about hadith being influenced by sectarian and political pressures was first formalized by Goldzinger. The idea is that Zuhri is an agent of the Umayyads who was used as a mouthpiece to propagate whatever Umayyad propaganda they wanted. Now, as Jonathan Brown notes, this idea was refuted by Nadia Abbott. He says, quote, Abbott presents an interesting challenge to Goldzinger's theory that the Umayyad government, with its agents like Az-Zuhri, instituted hadith collection and actively fabricated a substantial component of the hadith corpus pursuant to their political agenda. Evidence from our earlier sources on the origins of hadith study, she contends, portrays the Umayyads as concerned first and foremost with collecting the Prophet's teachings on administrative issues like tax and charity, not with material collected to the political image of their rule. She notes how the first attempt to collect hadiths ordered by the Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was limited to administrative hadiths. The hadiths that Az-Zuhri collected for the Umayyads for promulgation in the provinces dealt only with sadaqah. Abbott argues that the isnads that arose from Abu Hurairah emerged far earlier and were far more numerous than previously imagined. Umayyad rulers were attempting to make these private collections public, not ordering the forgery and circulation of baseless hadith. So again, hadith critic is just bootlicking Orientalists and regurgitating their propaganda.
Scholars who disagreed with rulers often faced harsh punishments. For example, Ibn Mujahid. He used political connections in order to enforce which Quranic readings were acceptable. The historical record shows that, quote, those who opposed Ibn Mujahid's officially promulgated canon and insisted on following their own standards and criteria were tried, flogged, and coerced into adhering to the consensus. This wasn't just a scholarly debate on which recitation of the Quran was the most accurate. It was an enforcement through violence. Similarly, you have Imam Malik, who was publicly punished by authorities. As the text notes, quote, he was once stripped and flogged by the then governor of Medina, Ja'far bin Sulaiman ibn Ali. While some claim this was for his position on divorce, Ibn Qutayba records that governor's reason for flogging and subsequently torturing him was because Malik thought nothing of the oath of allegiance to the Abbasids in power.
So the first claim here is that Ibn Mujahid was violently and viciously enforcing his understanding of the 7 modes of recitation upon everyone else. Now this is just a laughable distortion of what actually happened. First of all, Ibn Mujahid's Kitab al-Sab'a isn't canonizing the 7 modes of recitation. He nowhere says that in the book. What he's actually doing is just cataloging the different modes and recitations that were available to him and checking their authenticity. The second issue is that if we actually go back to the paper that's being cited by Melchurch, he notes that none of the trials mention the 7 recitations of Mujahid. The dispute was actually over using shad readings of the Quran, so readings that are actually outside the continental skeleton of Uthman. As such, that's why there was a punishment, because you're going against the established orthodoxy. Now, as far as the claim that Imam Malik was publicly lashed for going against the government, all the reports that transmit this event are weak, disconnected, and contradictory. Now, because Hadith Critic is such an incompetent buffoon, and because Lيفي is in such a good mood, I'll even grant you that this event happened. If we grant that this event is actually authentic, what it proves is that the state punished Imam Malik for him having his own stance, and that Imam Malik was rebelling against the political pressure that was imposed on him. For you to extrapolate from this event and say Imam Malik was the exception, and thus every other scholar was coerced by the political pressures of the government, is a claim that requires justification, which you have not provided. Now, if you guys benefited from today's video and want to see me continue to belt hadith rejectors, make sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
ابتسم واستقل ودور الأمجاد طالما تولى ما توالى باذلا نفس وملا قال إليك شهابا يلهي بالأرض اشتعالا في غبار الحرب يبدو مثل بدر يتنالى.
As a bonus for you guys, I'm going to be doing a hadith rejected tier list. So starting off with Goldinger, I think he's an easy B tier. He's a scholar, his influence is still felt to this day. He's the one who started this whole wave of skepticism, and even though some of his arguments are outdated and his method is subjective as hell, I feel like a B is fair because he's published and he's influential. Alright, so next we have Yoimball, or as Ustaz Farid Responds likes to call him, Uniball. I think he's an easy A tier. He's a scholar, he's published, he's influential, he's built a lot on the ideas of previous revisionists, for example with the idea of dives and spiders. Again, he does have a lot of brain-dead arguments like denying Nafi''s existence and rejecting all single-strand hadiths a priori. But if I was to reject everyone who made a stupid argument, everyone would be in F tier. So that's why I'm just going to leave him in A tier, because he's a scholar, he's published, he's influential. And even though he makes some stupid arguments like the stuff about companions living too long and whatever, I think he's still worthy of an A tier. Alright, so next we have my arch nemesis, Ustaz Dr. Joshua Little. Now, despite the fact that Ustaz Joshua has been running from me and he hasn't been the same since I belted him in my videos, I still think he's worthy of an A tier. His arguments are well structured and sophisticated. He puts a lot of thought into his arguments, and prima facie, a lot of his arguments seem convincing, especially to laymen, and it takes a lot of research to see exactly what assumptions he's smuggling in and what fallacies he's committing. He also builds on the work of previous revisionists, he's published, he's academic, so I think he's far and away the best so far. Alright, so next we have Naveed. Naveed's a piece of shit. He's going to the D tier. He doesn't even know what a contradiction is. And I baked him so hard on his server that he literally had to ban me and put me in jail chat. Plus, he's also a 19er. Hadith critic, completely terrible. He tries to sound smart. I'd say he's a bit better than Naveed, but not by much. Hadith critic is a fallacy machine. I think he made like 5 non sequiturs in the span of like 5 minutes, bro. I think that's like a world record. Also D tier. Alright, next we have Muhammad from God. I think C tier. I had a debate with him. And, you know, he's pretty low tier. He doesn't really engage with scholarship. He doesn't know what ikma is. And he got completely embarrassed when he fabricated quotes for Motsky and Sinai that just didn't exist. That being said, he does have pretty good rhetoric and he can catch a lot of laymen off guard. But I think he's probably one of the best when it comes to the apologetic stuff, but he's not on the scholarly level. Next we have Sheikh Shubhات, the OG Joseph Schacht. He's S tier. His ideas are so influential that literally any paper you read is likely going to cite Schacht's book like multiple times. You have to respect the fact that this man single-handedly set the trend for the entire scope of the Western study of hadith for the next like 100, 150 years, and the field is still recovering from Schacht to this day. So he's definitely S tier. Javad Hashmi, this guy's a kafir zindiq, la'natullah alayh. He says the Quran is asatir al-awwaleen. He's basically a shittier version of Joshua Little. He just copy-pastes his arguments, and he's completely terrible. He has no rhetoric, no redeeming qualities. He's a complete buffoon. F tier.